Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Apple recently admitted to doing something a lot of people have suspected has been going on for a long time, slowing down the performance of older iPhones. But is this issue as simple as it seems? So in late 2017, some interesting reports came out that show the average performance of iPhones over time, specifically centered around the iPhone 6s. The company Geekbench published these results because they offer benchmarking tools for lots of CPU platforms, not just desktops and laptops, but mobile devices as well. They're kind of becoming an industry standard, or at least one of them. And these results show that over major software revisions, as time has gone on, as these newer versions of software, the iOS operating system, have come out, the average performance of iPhones has gone down on these older devices. Some really telling graphs that show older iOS releases when iPhones were not as old, showing a much better hit rate of getting, maximum performance most of the time. And as time has gone on and new software releases have come out, more and more likely you will find phones that aren't performing to their maximum clock speed, their maximum, computational power. And this got a lot of people really interested and curious, trying to figure out what's going on. And what ultimately people came to the conclusion was that it has to do with not only the software release, but also the battery, because some phones with replacement batteries didn't exhibit that behavior. So clearly at some point, some change in the operating system was made that actually took battery condition into account when it came to how fast the phone performs. After these stories broke, ultimately Apple admitted, we at one point initiated, a new bit of code in the iOS operating system that basically checks the battery and doesn't let the phone perform to its maximum clock rate in certain conditions based on the health of that battery. Now, these pieces have actually been kind of put together quite a while ago. It just took people some time to put them all together and realize what was going on. In early 2017, we started to see this issue where iPhone 6s's would actually just spontaneously shut down, right? You'd be in the middle of working on something, you'd launch an app or do something, and the phone would just turn off on you. And Apple got wind of this, and ultimately it kind of became a bit of a deal, not a huge, groundbreaking type of snafu or anything, but enough people were affected by it that Apple added a software update to address it. And that software update came out at the end of January 2017. It was built into iOS 10.2.1. And Apple simply said, okay, we're making this software update in order to prevent these unexpected shutdowns on the iPhone 6s specifically. And what's interesting is if you go and look at those Geekbench results, iOS 10.2.0 shows very clearly that pretty much all of the phones, all the iPhone 6s's, always performed at their maximum clock rate. 10.2.1, you started to see these smaller peaks in the graph before that indicate a certain percentage, a certain portion of phones would perform or, benchmark not at their, proposed maximum, showing that, yes, in 10.2.1, this software change took effect and it was starting to slow down the performance, or maximum performance, I should say, of the iPhone 6s, like Apple said, in order to, fix the battery. Now, back when that software update was released, Apple didn't say what they had done. They just said, we implemented a fix to prevent these random, spontaneously, shutdowns of the 6s. but only now are we actually understanding really what happened. In order to really grasp why Apple did something like that, we need to understand and talk briefly about batteries in general. The vast majority of electronics use lithium-ion or lithium polymer batteries now. It's actually a fairly old battery technology. It's been around for well over 20 years in consumer electronics. But it's in some ways very different battery chemistry than other types that we're used to, either nickel cadmium or nickel metal hydride, that sort of thing. With lithium-ion or lithium-based batteries, rechargeables in general, you've got a maximum amount of charge that you can put into it, of course, right? So you charge the battery all the way up and that's its maximum. You can deplete the battery and recharge it and it goes back up to that maximum. Except over time, that maximum begins to decrease, right? As you put more charge cycles on the battery, the maximum capacity the battery can hold goes down. You're effectively wearing the battery out. These don't have infinite lifespans. The other thing is, as these batteries age, their ability to deliver instantaneous peaks of power starts to go down. So that's one thing that lithium-based batteries are really good at, is when you need to draw a ton of power really quickly, they're capable of delivering that. It's why Tesla automobiles have such good performance. They're based on lithium-ion batteries, which are really good at jamming a whole bunch of current out really, really quickly. And this is something that benefits smartphones and other mobile devices as well. I mean, if you think about it, your phone is sitting there most of the time at idle, but only when you're using it does it really need to ramp up in performance. So let's say you launch an app or you start playing a game or do some other process on the phone that needs to grab a lot of CPU resources, basically get the CPU to work harder. Well, that CPU is suddenly going to need a lot more power in order to ramp up its performance. So that's going to be a draw on the battery. If your battery is getting older, not only is it going to have less total capacity, meaning your device gets shorter runtime, but also that battery has less ability to jam out as much current as whatever, electronics in the phone require it. And that's actually the root of this whole iPhone 6s shutdown thing from early 2017, is these batteries were getting older and basically the CPU demanded a whole ton of power, but the battery couldn't provide it and the phone ended up crashing effectively. So the software update we now understand was Apple basically limiting the maximum performance of the CPU in order to smooth out those peaks a little bit, to give the battery a chance to deliver what current it could to keep the phone up and running. And if you think about it from that technical perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And I don't necessarily fault Apple for coming out with an update like that. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that Apple didn't come out with a feature like that a long time ago, because it's just one of those kind of technically common sense type of ideas. If the battery is not going to be able to perform as well later on in its life, you might as well do what you can in software to try and prolong that, or at least give end users the best experience that you can. Well, the fallout, of course, is that it's suddenly another big Apple scandal because everyone loves to try and take down the big guys, right? And I know a lot of you are going to start freaking out down in the comments. You probably have been already, talking about how horrible Apple is as a company and you'll never buy their products and blah, blah, blah. You know what? I don't really care. That's not really the point of this whole issue or even this podcast. Apple did what it did from a technical perspective because it thought it was the best course of action. And, I tend to agree. The real problem here, and this is what I've been seeing from the more level-headed tech pundits out there, the people who analyze this, not necessarily with the pitchforks out. The bigger thing that I see is people saying that while Apple's decision makes a lot of sense, and Apple has even said it's going to continue on with this. In fact, not only did they deploy that code for iPhone 6s devices, but in newer versions of iOS, like 11.2, it's starting to take effect for newer phones like the iPhone 7. For example, the iPhone 7, we didn't see any of this performance throttling until iOS 11.2. And as time goes on, we're going to see it a little bit more and more aggressively as these devices age and the batteries wear out. But the real issue that I've been seeing, and the one that I think of personally, is simply communication. And this is something that Apple has always kind of struggled at, right? The company has always been very secretive. It's never really wanted to get too deep into the nuts and bolts of what it's doing and why it's doing it. It's just going to be very end user experience oriented and focused. So when Apple makes these changes, like when they introduced iOS 10.2.1 to fix the whole random shutdown thing on the iPhone 6s, it didn't say what it did. It just said, okay, we're gonna fix it. And people were happy because it stopped the random shutdowns for them. But the issue of communication, of course, comes up. Well, should Apple have at least acknowledged why this was happening and explain what it had done? I don't think it would have hurt. And I think it would have gone a long way towards end user goodwill amongst the more power users in the community, right? It's not an issue that I think the majority of people are going to care about. Just the average, person who owns an iPhone, I don't even think most people would understand what this is, nor would they really care. All they know is that maybe their phone was crashing randomly before and now it's not. Hey, it's fixed. That's all the more they care about. But the really diehard, power users are going to be the most vocal. And they're the ones I think who are screaming the loudest about this thing. I intentionally decided to wait on this podcast a little bit. I could have rushed this one out right as this issue was happening, as the Apple announcement came out and all that, and joined the other chorus of YouTubers who tackled this topic, because there were quite a few of them. And everyone was really quick to rush to the pitchforks. Again, because a lot of people just want to tear down the big guy, right? There's a lot of anti-Apple sentiment out there. And you know what? There always has been, and there always will be. This is nothing new. We've seen this periodically for a very long time. And I'm not really here necessarily to defend Apple. If anything, I'm actually a bit disappointed. Because while I think Apple should have had code like this in iOS, going back quite a bit, because I think it would have solved a lot of other problems that people had with iPhones. At the same time, I think the lack of communication and the lack of flexibility on Apple's part is really disappointing. I think they should have explained when that previous software update came out what was going on. But what's more, I think Apple should have been a little bit more proactive, explaining to the non-technical end user of its products what was going on and what they can do to fix it. A lot of this whole scandal, or whatever you want to call it, going on right now about this issue could easily have been resolved with as simple as a little pop-up message on the phone saying, hey, end user, the battery on your phone, it's starting to age. We're going to do the best thing that we can to try and keep your phone up and running and try and give you the best experience. But FYI, if you want to get the most out of your phone or continue to get the most out of your phone, go get the battery replaced. Now, of course, this is going to bring up the topic of battery replacements in iPhones in general. Lots of people love to crap all over the iPhone because you can't really replace the battery easily. At least not as easily as some other phones that have, removable back covers, and you can simply go buy a battery on Amazon or eBay or whatever and slap it in and you're done. The whole discussion of form factor and all that aside, this is just where the industry is going, right? Everyone wants thinner, lighter, smaller stuff. And by everyone, I mean the average end user, right? The power users, of course, they're happy to carry around a giant brick of a phone if it gives them all of the power user features that they want. But, if we know anything, it's that Apple really doesn't cater so much to the power user market, at least not right now. They're finally getting a little bit back into it. And that's partially where this issue is so disappointing, was Apple seemed to kind of turn a corner. In the middle of 2017, we saw this major push from professionals, like creative professionals who want newer, more powerful Macs. And it seemed like Apple had been neglecting that market segment for an increasing amount of time. In fact, I did a couple of podcast episodes about it myself. But it seems like in mid-2017, Apple did something that it had never done before, in that it actually held, I don't want to say a press conference, but a really frank conversation with a few different tech, publications, where it spoke fairly frankly about how it values that professional market and what it was going to do to make things right. It seemed like at the time, Apple was really going to actually open up and start to communicate better. And a lot of people appreciated that. And Apple's actually making good on some of the promises from that conversation. So to have this issue crop up and have this big fervor about Apple slowing down phones become the big issue that it is because of a lack of communication is really disappointing. I think like I said, it could have been as simple as Apple throwing a little pop-up on the screen of the phone saying, hey, your battery is getting older, you should get it replaced. And, battery replacements on all of these modern smartphones that aren't user replaceable really aren't that expensive. And, for the Android fanboys out there, Android phones aren't exempt from this either. An increasing number of Android phones are coming with built-in batteries that can't be easily swapped by the end user. Like I said, it's just an industry trend that we need to get used to, but it's still possible to do. And in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, if you figure you've dropped several $100s on a phone, to spend $60 to $80 to have a built-in battery professionally replaced to give you another year or two of life still makes good financial sense, because these devices are lasting longer. And I think that's perhaps another factor at play with this whole performance issue. In years past, the level of innovation in phones was much, much faster, right? Everyone wanted to upgrade their phone every 2 years simply because whatever was new at the time was so much better in so many different ways. There was a major benefit to upgrading, just like computers back in the 90s and early 2000s. It seemed like if you waited 2 or 3 years, you would get a new computer that was so much faster than the one that you had. But you look at computers now, and every year, there's some performance improvement, but it's not necessarily worth giving up what you currently have and spending all that money on something new. We're seeing the same thing with iPhones. The fact that there are plenty of people out there still rocking iPhone 6S's says something. They perform well enough for most people. So it's that, extended life of these devices. The fact that people are using them longer is why issues like this are going to crop up. It's not so much that the CPU in these older, in quotes, phones isn't up to the task anymore. It's other parts of the hardware that are starting to fail. So I wish Apple had been better at communicating this, had maybe given people some options, a simple toggle in the settings of the OS saying, which would you prefer, better performance or better battery life? Obviously, if it's an issue due to that peak power output part of it, maybe that slowing down needs to take effect. I don't think anyone would want to flip on a toggle that says, I'm willing to take the risk of having my phone randomly crash on me because I'm running an old battery. But maybe people would be willing to live with a shorter overall runtime of their phone if it gave them the better performance. If anything, just putting an option like that in the OS would go a long way towards smoothing things over with these very vocal power users who, frankly, I think have made this a bit of a bigger issue than it needs to be. But like I said, I'm still a bit disappointed at Apple's response to this whole thing. Now, characteristically, Apple is not playing this like it's a big deal. And in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. And we also need to get used to the fact that this is going to be a feature, something that's going to be in the OS going forward. And I also suspect this is something that we'll start to see in Android devices if it isn't there already, because they're going to suffer the exact same fate. This is going to be an industry-wide problem or concern. It's not just unique to iPhones. Maybe we haven't seen this be an issue in Android phones simply because there are so many of them and they have so many varied specifications and capabilities. I also think that Android phones are facing the same, issues with people using them longer and longer. There's less incentive to upgrade. I suspect there are a lot of people that are still using older Android devices, so this may become an issue sooner or later for them as well. And maybe as an industry, we just need to decide, how do we want to handle this, right? Do we want to tackle it from a hardware perspective and just say, you know what, the best way forward is to make these batteries user replaceable? Or do we tackle it from the software perspective like Apple seems to be doing and have the software try and manage the hardware of the phone as best it can to give the best end user experience? Before I wrap this up, I think it's worth discussing, at least briefly, the whole concept of how much power do you give the end user in situations like this. And it's a struggle that I think we've seen for quite a while, and it's perhaps becoming a bigger and bigger issue now. You think about computers from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and you think about how relatively unstable they were, but also how complicated they were. In the 80s, you needed to be a power user in order to understand and take full advantage of a computer. In the 90s, I'd like to say computers became a bit more democratized, where we started to see more, in quotes, average people buying and using computers. But I feel like the frustration level was higher amongst end users simply because computers weren't that much easier to use. They were just as prone to break and fail, if not more so. And you'd see a lot of frustration. Like I've talked in previous podcasts about how I, used to work at a computer store when I was in high school, and I'd see a lot of people bringing computers in for service that didn't have any hardware issues at all. A lot of times when we brought a computer in for repair, it was because it simply needed to have a software fix done to it. Either somebody had gone in and played with some settings that they shouldn't have, or they got a really nasty virus or something like that, and they just needed to have Windows reinstalled on the machine. But think about the people who didn't consider bringing their computer in for repair, where they looked at it and went, well, this thing is 2 years old. It's not working right. I'm just going to throw it out and buy a new one. Well, that's kind of a lot of wasted money. And I feel like the industry has tackled that. Computers have become easier to use, in spite of the fact that they have way more power and way more complexity than ever before. I mean, you look at something like the Windows 10 rollout. Previously, Microsoft would never have offered a free operating system to people, but also done it in such a way where you can just click a button and have it install. And for the most part, people were done after that, right? Usually when you install Windows on a computer, it's a fairly complicated process. Yeah, installing Windows itself may have been simple and straightforward, but you've got to go out and get all the drivers and make sure all your programs still work, that sort of thing. By and large, upgrading to Windows 10 was really straightforward and fairly seamless for a lot of people. Of course, there were exceptions, but computers have become easier to use and more straightforward, and I think that's due to a lot of diligence on the part of these manufacturers trying to get past that whole computers are complicated and you need to really understand them well in order to use them sort of mentality. But it's a bit of a struggle, right? Because the easier you want a computer to be, the less power you can give the end user, if you think about it, right? You have to hide all the buttons and toggles that let people do exactly what they want, Because if you make them out front and easy, a certain percentage of people are just going to go in and push those buttons to see what they do, not necessarily understanding the ramifications of it. And so if you just go in and start randomly pressing buttons, you may end up having a lesser experience. And so that's really been Apple's claim to fame, is why I would say, its devices just work so well. What the main appeal to them is by the general public is they're simple, they're easy to use, they're reliable. What's the drawback? You don't have as many features. Android phones, you can do anything you want really with them, but you're also giving the end users enough rope to hang themselves. So it's this double-edged sword. And I can't help but wonder where that balance needs to be struck, or how do you best handle that? Is it possible for Apple to expose a lot more features in iOS so that the power users can feel like iPhones are just as customizable as Android devices? Absolutely, Apple could do it. But what's the risk? What's the cost? How do you do that in such a way where the average end user who doesn't necessarily know any better, who doesn't understand all those things, won't go in and effectively, quote, mess up their phone, but at the same time giving people who do know all of that stuff and do know better, giving them what they want? It's a tough balance to strike. And I think this is just another data point in that whole conversation of, how do we get it so that the computers aren't running us? Well, we're still continuing to run the computers ourselves, because especially with the concept of AI and neural networks and all this stuff, it seems like increasingly the computers are dictating what's going on and not so much us, right? We're just using them at an increasingly more surface level. And maybe not as many people are getting as deep into them as we could, I don't know. It's curious. It's confusing. It's frustrating when you've got to have these kinds of battles. Of course, this whole, iPhone performance battery thing is just going to be more fuel for the fire for people who hate Apple. In some ways, I don't necessarily blame them. Because, everybody's got to have an agenda. And if yours is that you want to tear Apple down whenever you possibly can, well, hey, there you go. Apple just gave you a freebie. For the more level-headed folks, like I said, I'm not necessarily angry at Apple for this, but I'm definitely disappointed and perhaps a little bit frustrated that we continue to see this whole, well, we're just going to do stuff and not necessarily tell you about it until we get called out on it sort of thing. Where's Apple going to go from here with this? Is Apple even going to do anything to address this other than just saying, yeah, we'll own up to it and get used to it? Well, we're already starting to see some class action lawsuits being filed about this. I will say that, the only people who win in class action lawsuits are the lawyers. I don't think anyone who owns an iPhone 6S is going to see a free battery out of this or even any money back in their pocket. They're not going to get a check for any kind of money for dealing with the slow performance. That's generally a rare outcome from any sort of class action. But it may be enough to spur Apple into popping up a message on screen or throwing a small toggle in the OS somewhere where you can pick, do you prefer battery life or do you prefer performance? Something like that. I think we may get better communication out of Apple towards end users as a result of this whole situation. And at the same time, I think other phone manufacturers are going to take notice and maybe they'll do the same thing. We may see something like this baked into Android as well. Or if not baked into Android directly, maybe some of the bigger Android phone makers will add it in. Maybe Samsung will see this and learn from Apple's misstep, whatever you want to call it, and realize, hey, maybe we need to do the same thing and add in a feature like that says, hey, your phone is 2 years old, or hey, your battery's got 500 charge cycles on it, or something like that, just to let the end user know what's going on, to put a little bit more power back in the end user's hands in a way that they can understand. Anyway, I am, of course, curious as to your thoughts on this one, other than all of the comments that I'm sure are piling up down below about people saying, oh, this is why I don't use Apple products and screw Apple, blah, blah, blah. Other than those, aside from that, what do you think? Have you been impacted by this, either directly or indirectly? Do you have a newer iPhone that you know is going to be affected by this? What do you think? Is this going to spur you to maybe consider a battery replacement sooner than you would have otherwise considered? Or are you just going to deal with the issue and understand, yeah, this is the way the technology works, and you're okay with that decision having been, made for you effectively? So just, be sure to be nice about it. Let's keep this conversation civil, but hit your comments up down below. If you like the episode, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram @thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.